The plane that had captured his heart, his boots echoing against the showroom floor. Each step he took seemed to defy the weight of the sneers and whispers around him. His gaze remained fixed on the jet, refusing to waver. Thomas understood that the battle he faced wasn't just about buying a plane, it was about proving to himself and to those watching that he belonged. Greg, emboldened by the laughter and murmurs, followed Thomas. His voice cut through the air, loud enough to draw the attention of everyone in the room. "Hey, where are you going? Don't waste your time daydreaming about things out of your reach." Thomas stopped in his tracks and turned to face Greg. His expression remained calm, though his eyes burned with quiet resolve. "I didn't come here to waste time," he said, his voice firm but steady. "I came here to make a purchase." The declaration caused a ripple of disbelief to spread across the showroom. Greg laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the space. "A purchase? Do you even know how much these jets cost? You don't just walk in here and buy one on a whim." Unfazed, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a statement of his financial assets, a testament to years of hard work, discipline, and sacrifice. "I know exactly how much it costs," he said, unfolding the paper and holding it up for Greg to see. "And I'm prepared to pay." Greg's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he recovered, his skepticism turning into irritation. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we don't entertain jokes here. If you're serious, prove it." Thomas nodded and gestured toward the jet he had been admiring. "I'll prove it. Let's finalize the deal for that one." Greg hesitated. He wasn't sure whether to take Thomas seriously, but the confidence in the farmer's voice left him no choice. Reluctantly, he motioned for one of his colleagues to join them. "Fine. Let's see what you've got." As they walked toward the sales desk, the other customers exchanged murmurs of disbelief and amusement. Some watched with smug expressions, certain that Thomas would be exposed as a fraud. Others whispered quietly, unsure of what to make of the unfolding scene. At the sales desk, Greg began typing on the computer, entering the details of the jet Thomas had chosen. He spoke with a condescending tone, emphasizing every large number as if to intimidate Thomas. "The base price of this jet is $3.5 million. With the additional features you're requesting, the total comes to $4.2 million. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Without hesitation, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He calmly filled out a check for the full amount and handed it to Greg. The room fell silent as Greg stared at the check in disbelief. He examined it closely, expecting to find some error or forgery, but everything was in order. "I told you," Thomas said, his voice steady. "I came here to make a purchase." Greg's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. He didn't want to admit it, but there was no denying that Thomas had proven him wrong. The silence in the showroom was deafening as everyone processed what had just happened. The older man who had mocked Thomas earlier adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, suddenly interested in the floor tiles. The woman who had suggested Thomas was there for a giveaway shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. Even the receptionist, who had joined in the laughter, looked down at her desk, pretending to be busy. Thomas turned to Greg, his expression calm but firm. "Next time someone walks in here, don't judge them by their appearance. You never know their story or what they're capable of." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded stiffly and handed Thomas the paperwork to sign. As Thomas completed the transaction, a quiet murmur began to spread through the room, not of judgment, but of respect. When the deal was finalized, Thomas walked back to the jet he had just purchased. He ran his hand along its surface one last time, a quiet smile playing on his lips. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a statement to everyone in the room and beyond. Dreams are achieved through hard work, determination, and the courage to stand tall in the face of prejudice. As he stepped out of the showroom, the murmurs of the onlookers faded into the background. Thomas didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already proven what he came to prove. Thomas clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of every judgmental gaze in the room. The air around him seemed heavier, thick with scorn and prejudice, but he refused to let it crush him. He straightened his back, taking a deep breath before replying, his voice steady yet firm. "And what makes you so certain I can't afford my dreams?" The older man smirked, his confidence unshaken. Your appearance speaks volumes, he replied, gesturing dismissively at Thomas's worn-out attire. Success leaves its marks. Expensive suits, polished shoes, a certain refinement. You, my friend, carry none of that. So forgive me if I don't take you seriously. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Thomas could feel the derisive smiles behind him. He remained still, his gaze never leaving the man's face. James, who had stayed quiet until now, stepped closer to Thomas. You'd be surprised what real success looks like, he said, his tone sharp and unwavering. It's not always wrapped in designer clothes or fancy watches. Sometimes, it looks like resilience, hard work, and a refusal to quit, things you wouldn't understand. The older man chuckled, clearly unimpressed. Touching speech, he said sarcastically. But let's not get carried away. This isn't some fairy tale where effort magically buys you luxury. This is the real world, and in the real world, appearances matter. Thomas felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. Instead, he let his determination surface. Appearances may matter to people like you, he said, his voice calm but resolute. But I didn't get where I am by caring about shallow opinions. I came here with a purpose, and I intend to see it through, whether you believe in me or not. The older man's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. Fine, he said, crossing his arms. If you're so serious, prove it. Show us you belong here. Thomas took a step forward, his boots echoing on the polished floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. Unfolding it, he held it up for the man to see, a letter of pre-approval from a respected financial institution, confirming his ability to purchase the jet. The room fell silent. The older man's smug expression wavered as he read the document, his eyes scanning it repeatedly as if searching for a mistake. Greg, who had been watching the exchange with amusement, now looked visibly uncomfortable. Thomas let the silence linger for a moment before speaking. You judged me without knowing anything about me. You assumed that because I don't look like you, I must not belong here. But let me tell you something. I've worked harder than you can imagine to stand where I am today. And I won't let anyone, least of all you, tell me I don't deserve it. James clapped Thomas on the shoulder, his expression one of pride. That's right, he said, his voice carrying across the room. Dreams aren't about appearances, they're about heart, determination, and the courage to face people like you. The older man looked away, clearly uncomfortable, while the murmurs in the room shifted tone. A few people exchanged uneasy glances, and some even nodded in reluctant acknowledgement of Thomas's words. Greg, however, wasn't ready to back down. So, you have a piece of paper, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. That doesn't mean you understand what it takes to own and maintain a jet. This isn't a game. Thomas turned to face him, his expression calm but unyielding. You're right, he said. It's not a game. And that's exactly why I'm here. I know the value of hard work and responsibility. I've built my life on those principles, and I'm not about to stop now. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut through the tension, a voice belonging to a senior sales executive who had been quietly observing the scene from a distance. That's enough, the executive said, his tone firm. All eyes turned toward him as he approached the group. He was an older man with a commanding presence, dressed impeccably but carrying an air of fairness that immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. Mr. Thomas, the executive said, addressing him directly, I apologize for the behavior you've been subjected to today. This is not how we conduct business, and I assure you it will be addressed. Thomas nodded, appreciating the man's sincerity, though he remained guarded. The executive turned to Greg and the older man who had mocked Thomas. And as for you two, he said, his voice cold, I suggest you reevaluate your understanding of professionalism and respect. This company prides itself on serving clients from all walks of life, and your behavior today has been unacceptable. Greg paled, his confidence evaporating under the executive's scrutiny. The older man muttered something under his breath but wisely chose not to argue. The executive returned his attention to Thomas. If you're still interested, I'd be happy to personally assist you with your purchase, he said. Thomas hesitated for a moment before nodding. I am, he said simply. As the executive led Thomas and James toward his office, the room slowly returned to its usual hum of activity. But the atmosphere had shifted. The onlookers, who had once mocked and judged Thomas, now watched him with a mix of respect and unease. For Thomas, the battle wasn't just about purchasing a plane, it was about proving that dignity and determination could prevail against prejudice. And as he walked forward, he carried with him not just the weight of his dreams, but the strength of knowing he had faced the storm and refused to yield. Greg stood a few steps away, his arms crossed and a cold smirk plastered on his face. His silence was deafening, a silent endorsement of the venomous comments spilling from the older man's mouth. The words dripped with condescension, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. James, unable to restrain himself any longer, stepped forward, his expression hardened with a mixture of anger and disgust. I don't recall there being a rule that says someone can't buy an airplane based on how they dress or what they do for a living, James said coldly, his voice sharp enough to pierce the tense air. He locked eyes with the older man, his stance firm. Or is it that you think you have the right to decide who belongs here? The man chuckled dismissively, though a flicker of irritation passed through his eyes. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking, he replied with a shrug, his smirk deepening. But if you're his friend, it's no wonder. Do you even know where you are? This isn't a place for taking chances. James started to reply, but before he could, Thomas stepped forward. His presence commanded the room, and his voice, though low, carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around him. I know exactly where I am, Thomas said, his tone steady and unwavering. I'm here to buy an airplane, and I don't need anyone's approval in this room to do it. The words hung in the air, silencing the room as if a storm had just passed through. The older man hesitated for a moment, his arrogance faltering but not entirely dissipating. Oh, really? The man sneered, folding his arms. Then show us what you've got. But remember, not everyone is cut out for big things. Thomas didn't respond immediately. He held the man's gaze, his expression unreadable but resolute. Finally, he turned to James. Let's go, he said calmly, his tone carrying a quiet power. Yet inside, a fire burned fiercely, fueled by a mixture of pride and unyielding determination. As Thomas and James walked away, the showroom fell into a tense silence. But it wasn't a silence born of respect. It was a silence heavy with judgment and anticipation, as if they were all waiting for Thomas to stumble. And Thomas knew this was only the beginning of a battle he could not afford to lose. They had barely stepped away from the airplane when a mocking laugh echoed from behind them, sharp and laden with challenge. The sound pierced Thomas's patience, igniting the simmering anger within him. He froze mid-step, his hands clenching tightly at his sides. The middle-aged man, the source of the taunt, raised an eyebrow and smirked, his voice dripping with derision. Oh, you're leaving already. The man called out, his words carrying across the room with cruel clarity. I thought someone as ambitious as you might try to prove something. But perhaps I overestimated my expectations. Thomas turned around slowly, his movements deliberate and resolute. His gaze locked onto the man, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Each step he took back toward the man was measured, but each one carried the weight of unspoken defiance. What do you want me to prove? Thomas asked, his voice deep and steady, yet brimming with authority. His eyes, now alight with a newfound confidence, bore into the man's with unwavering intensity. I didn't come here to please anyone in this room. I came to get what I know I deserve. His words rang out like a thunderclap, shattering the oppressive atmosphere of contempt. The man's eyes flickered with a brief moment of surprise, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. Nice speech, the man said with a dismissive shrug. But we all know talk doesn't buy anything. Thomas's lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the smile of a man who had been underestimated far too often but had always found a way to rise above. Slowly, he reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and pulled out a check. Holding it up for everyone in the room to see, the amount written on it caused audible gasps to ripple through the crowd. It matched the exact value of the airplane he had been inspecting. The room fell into stunned silence. The murmurs, the mocking laughter, the disdainful glances, all of it vanished as if it had never existed. The middle-aged man's smirk faltered, his eyes darting between the check and Thomas's unflinching expression. Struggling to process what he was seeing, he opened his mouth, but no words came out. Greg, the salesman, stood frozen by the display counter, his earlier smug confidence now replaced by visible unease. He gripped the edge of the counter tightly, his knuckles turning white. Thomas took another step forward, extending the check toward the middle-aged man. "You're right," he said, his tone calm yet razor-sharp. "Words don't buy anything. But money does. And I have what it takes to turn my dreams into reality. So, do you have anything else to say?" The man's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound emerged. Thomas lowered the check and turned his gaze to the rest of the room. The once derisive stares now avoided his, the confidence in their judgments crumbling under the weight of his unyielding resolve. "To me, what any of you think doesn't matter," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. "What matters is that I know who I am, and I know what I deserve. If anyone in this room believes I don't belong here, they should take a hard look at themselves." His words struck a nerve, leaving an unmistakable mark on everyone present. Behind him, James stood silently, a quiet pride evident in his expression. Greg, visibly flustered, finally stepped forward, his earlier arrogance now replaced by nervousness. "Sir, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Greg stammered, his voice shaky. "If you're genuinely interested in purchasing the aircraft, we'd be happy to assist you." Thomas turned his gaze to Greg, his eyes as sharp as a blade. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his tone incredulous. "No, there's been no misunderstanding. I think you're fully aware of the attitude you've displayed toward me since the moment I walked in. Let me make this clear. I don't need your assistance. I'll buy the plane from a place that understands how to respect its customers." His final words silenced all argument. Thomas turned and walked away, his steps slow but filled with dignity. Behind him, the showroom was engulfed in awkward silence and discomfort. Yet within him, the fire of determination burned brighter than ever. This wasn't just about buying an airplane, it was about proving to himself and the world that no one had the right to judge another's worth based on appearances alone. Greg stuttered, trying to steady his voice. "We didn't mean any harm. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Marcus's tone sharpened, cutting through the tense silence in the room. "A misunderstanding that you looked down on my father simply because he was dressed differently. A misunderstanding that you thought you had the right to decide who belongs here." Greg froze, unable to reply. Others in the room, including the customers who had joined in the ridicule, avoided Marcus's piercing gaze. The silence enveloped the space, broken only by Marcus's firm voice. "If there isn't an apology right now, I won't let this slide," Marcus declared. "I'm a lawyer. My father wasn't just insulted, he was subjected to blatant discrimination in a public business setting. I will pursue legal action against you and this company if necessary." A few whispers rippled through the room, but no one dared to oppose him. Greg swallowed hard, his face pale. Finally, he awkwardly bowed his head toward Thomas. "Sir, I apologize if my words offended you." Thomas met Greg's eyes, his expression no longer angry but steady and resolute. "This apology isn't for me. It's a lesson for you all to learn how to treat everyone with respect, no matter how they look or where they come from." Marcus stood silently beside his father, his gaze still stern. He turned to the group of customers who had mocked Thomas earlier. "What about you? Did you think you had the right to laugh at my father just because he's not like you?" No one responded. The middle-aged man who had been the loudest earlier mumbled incoherently before quickly lowering his head. A few others hurriedly found excuses to leave the gallery, unwilling to face Marcus any longer. Marcus turned back to his father and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Dad, let's go. They've seen enough." Yet within Marcus, a fire of resolve continued to burn. He knew this wasn't just a single act of disrespect, it was a deeper issue. One he was determined to fight so that no one would ever dare to look down on his father again. When Thomas and Marcus left the airport, it seemed the matter had ended there. But for Marcus, this was far more than a personal conflict. It was an insult to his father's dignity, honor, and human rights, and he was determined to bring it to light. A few weeks later, a lawsuit was officially filed in the local court. The company owning the aircraft showroom was accused of discriminatory practices and humiliating a customer, specifically Thomas. Marcus led the legal team, crafting a solid case with an arsenal of evidence, witnesses, and compelling arguments. At the first hearing, the courtroom was packed. Representatives of the company, attorneys, and involved employees were all present, including Greg, the man who had directly mocked Thomas. Greg's face was visibly tense as he sat quietly with the company's legal team, avoiding Marcus's piercing gaze. Marcus began his opening statement with a calm but powerful tone. "Your Honor," he said, his eyes scanning the room, "we are here today to shed light on a painful truth. Discrimination not only exists but is being tolerated in modern business environments. My father, Thomas, was subjected to an unacceptable act, an act no one in this society should have to endure." The company's attorney immediately rose to object. "Your Honor, we believe this case has been exaggerated. The remarks Mr. Thomas overheard were mere misunderstandings, not intended to offend or discriminate." Marcus remained undeterred. "Misunderstandings." He emphasized each syllable, his sharp eyes locking on the opposing team. "We have clear evidence that this was no misunderstanding but a deliberate attempt to humiliate and demean my father, and I will prove that." Now Marcus signaled for a young woman to take the witness stand. It was Patricia, an employee at the aircraft showroom. She was the only staff member who had discreetly recorded the incident, unable to bear her colleague's mistreatment of Thomas. "Patricia, can you recount what you witnessed that day?" Marcus asked, his voice low yet commanding. Patricia took a deep breath, her gaze briefly landing on Greg, who now looked as though he wanted to shrink into his seat. "I saw everything," she said firmly. "Greg and some customers made discriminatory remarks toward Mr. Thomas. They mocked him for his appearance and profession. I couldn't stay silent, so I secretly recorded the conversation." Marcus nodded, a hint of a confident smile crossing his face. "Do you have that recording?" Patricia nodded and handed her phone to Marcus. He connected it to the courtroom's audio system. As the recording played, the room fell into a heavy silence. The mocking voices of Greg and the customers rang out clearly. "You think you can afford a plane dressed like that? Go back to your farm. He probably thinks this is a charity giveaway." Each statement cut through the room like a knife, leaving the air heavy with tension. Greg stared at the table, his face pale, while the company's attorneys tried to maintain composure, though it was evident they had little left to argue. When the recording ended, Marcus stepped forward, addressing the judge directly. "Your Honor, this is not a misunderstanding. This is discrimination, a deliberate assault on my father's dignity. And it's not just my father, Thomas, who is a victim. Anyone who looks different from their ideal customer could easily become a target." The company's lawyer stood to counter. "We do not deny that those remarks were inappropriate. However, the company cannot be held accountable for individual actions that were neither sanctioned nor reflective of management policy." Marcus turned sharply, his gaze like a laser cutting through the opposition's defense. "The company cannot evade responsibility," he said, his tone calm yet razor sharp. "This isn't just about individual behavior. This is about the environment the company fosters, an environment that tolerates and fails to address such conduct. If the company doesn't take responsibility, then who will?" The judge, seated at the high bench, nodded slowly. "The evidence is very clear," he said gravely. "We will proceed with this case to determine the extent of the company's and the individual's responsibilities. But I must say, what I've heard so far is deeply troubling." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Marcus turned to look at his father, his eyes filled with determination. Thomas gave a subtle nod, a silent expression of pride in his son. Yet Marcus knew the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning of the journey to justice. When the recording played in the courtroom, all eyes turned toward the speaker. Each sarcastic remark and mocking comment echoed clearly, thickening the atmosphere in the room. The words weren't just insults. They carried a distinct prejudice against Thomas, not only for his appearance but also for his background. Thomas's face remained calm, but his hands clenched tightly on his lap, as if to keep himself from showing the pain. Patricia, seated at the witness stand, took a deep breath before speaking. "These words aren't just offensive. They reflect the attitude Mr. Thomas endured the moment he stepped into that showroom. I worked there, and I witnessed it all. What you just heard is the truth, and it happens daily to those they deem unworthy of being there." Across the room, the company's lawyers fidgeted at the damning evidence. One of them, a younger attorney, leaned toward Greg, who sat frozen, his face pale and drenched in sweat. No amount of whispered counsel could undo the damage already done. The middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair rose to his feet, his demeanor strained as he attempted damage control. Your Honor, we do not deny that these remarks are inappropriate. However, we contend that this was an individual act and does not represent the company's policies or values. Marcus stood immediately, his expression unwavering, cold, and firm. Does not represent the company. He emphasized each word, his voice cutting through the courtroom with the weight of conviction. Your Honor, this is an environment where such behavior is tolerated. Greg, the salesperson, was not merely acting alone, he was supported by approving glances from his colleagues and even customers in the showroom. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a systemic issue. The company's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, trying to maintain composure, but the unease was evident. We will implement additional training for employees and enforce stricter oversight moving forward, another lawyer interjected, attempting to redirect the narrative and mitigate the damage. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but laced with intensity. Training alone won't suffice, he declared. My father is not the first person to be treated this way, and unless significant actions are taken, he won't be the last. This company must take responsibility, not just for the words spoken, but for the systemic silence that enables such behavior. The judge, an older woman with a stern expression, finally spoke, her measured tone cutting through the tension. After listening to the recording and arguments from both sides, it is clear that the evidence presented demonstrates Mr. Thomas was subjected to unfair and discriminatory treatment. This cannot simply be dismissed as an individual's actions. The company has a duty to create a fair business environment, one that does not tolerate such behavior. She turned her gaze to the company's legal team, her eyes sharp and unyielding. I advise you to reconsider your stance before we proceed. Do you wish to continue arguing, or would you consider discussing a reasonable settlement? The company's lawyers huddled together in hushed discussion, their concern evident. But Marcus wasn't done. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm but resolute, my father didn't come here for a token apology or superficial measures. He came here to reclaim the respect and dignity that were stripped from him. We won't stop until justice is served. The courtroom fell silent for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Greg sat motionless, his face pale. The company's lawyers, after another hurried discussion, finally stood. We are willing to discuss settlement terms, one of them said reluctantly, their voice low. The judge nodded. Good. We will proceed with settlement discussions in the next session. But let me remind you, if a satisfactory resolution is not reached, this case will proceed to trial, and I will ensure that justice is served. Marcus turned to Thomas, a faint smile on his lips. We're on the right track, Dad, he whispered, his eyes shining with determination. Thomas nodded slightly, his face filled with pride. Yet Marcus knew this was just the beginning of their fight. The battle was far from over. On the final morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Rows of seats were filled with reporters, witnesses, and curious onlookers, all drawn by the case that had captivated public attention. Standing at the plaintiff's side, Thomas and Marcus maintained composed demeanors, though they both understood the gravity of the moment. This was the pivotal juncture, the moment that would determine whether justice would truly prevail. The judge entered, her expression stern, her presence commanding immediate silence. After a few moments to settle the room, she began delivering the verdict. Members of the court, after thoroughly reviewing all the evidence and hearing testimonies from both sides, I have reached the conclusion that Mr. Thomas has endured severe discrimination in a public business setting. The recorded statements presented in court are not only personally offensive but also reveal a culture of disrespect and tolerance for misconduct within the defendant company. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the defense team, increasing the tension in the room. This behavior violates fundamental principles of fair business practices and is contrary to existing laws regarding human rights and anti-discrimination. The company's legal team avoided eye contact, their heads lowered. Greg, at the center of the controversy, sat silently, his face pale. Some of the customers who had joined in mocking Thomas were also present, now avoiding the judgmental gazes of others in the courtroom. The judge's voice grew firmer as she continued. Therefore, I declare that the defendant company is directly responsible for acts of discrimination and harassment against Mr. Thomas. The company is ordered to pay a substantial fine of $500,000. This amount will be used to compensate Mr. Thomas and fund programs promoting equality and combating discrimination. A low murmur spread through the courtroom, the weight of the penalty sinking in. It was a hefty sum, one that would undoubtedly impact the company's reputation and operations. But the judge wasn't finished. In addition, she said, her authoritative tone brooking no argument, the company is required to implement mandatory training programs on equality and anti-discrimination for all employees. These programs will be supervised by an independent body to ensure their effectiveness. This measure is not just to address the harm caused but to prevent such incidents from happening again. Marcus nodded slightly, satisfaction flickering across his face. This was what he had hoped for from the start. Not just financial compensation, but systemic change within the company's culture. The judge turned her gaze to the company's representatives, her face reflecting clear disappointment. I also mandate that the company issue a public apology to Mr. Thomas, both in writing and across public media platforms. An apology is not just an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, it is the first step toward rebuilding trust with the community. The room fell silent once more, the only sound being the rustling of the judge's papers as she concluded. This court is adjourned, she declared, striking her gavel firmly. Thomas turned to Marcus, his eyes brimming with gratitude and pride. You did it, he said softly, his voice choked with emotion. Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder, his own eyes gleaming with determination. This is justice, Dad, he replied, his voice steady and resolute. As Thomas and Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight seemed brighter, illuminating the airport grounds. Reporters and onlookers surrounded them, cameras flashing incessantly, but Thomas paid them no mind. All he felt was a profound sense of relief and pride in his son, who had fought tirelessly to uphold his dignity. Standing beside his father, Marcus faced the crowd and spoke with unwavering conviction. Justice is not just something we seek. It is something everyone deserves. And today, justice was served. The morning sunlight illuminated the airport grounds, reflecting brilliantly off the luxurious planes displayed outdoors. Stepping out of a sleek SUV, Thomas, now clad in a tailored suit and polished leather shoes, walked confidently into the showroom where everything had begun. This was not the man in faded work clothes and mud-streaked boots from years ago. This was a man who had endured scorn and risen above it. Walking beside him, Marcus matched his father's confident stride, his expression resolute and his heart filled with pride for the journey they had undertaken together. The employees who had once mocked Thomas stood frozen, their once confident chatter silenced, leaving only the awkward shuffle of eyes as they searched for somewhere to focus. Greg, the leader of the group that had ridiculed Thomas most openly, now found himself standing behind the counter, his posture hunched and shoulders tight, as if trying to disappear into the shadows. The bravado that had once defined him seemed to have melted away, replaced by an unmistakable unease. As his eyes briefly met Thomas's, he quickly looked away, unable to bear the weight of what he had said and done. Thomas strode forward, stepping confidently into the heart of the showroom. He paused in front of Greg and a few of the other employees, his eyes sweeping over each one of them. His gaze was calm, deliberate, yet it carried an undeniable sense of power, a quiet confidence that filled the space. A faint smile appeared on his lips, not one of forgiveness, but of quiet victory. Do you remember me? Thomas's voice rang out, deep and steady, carrying through the room. His question hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as the silence stretched longer. The response came in the form of hesitant nods, no one daring to speak up. The last time I walked out of here, Thomas continued, his tone unshakable, each word deliberately slow, as though pressing on the memories they wished they could forget. You laughed. You mocked me. You judged me based on how I looked. But today, I'm not here to buy a plane from you. No, I'm here to remind you that attitudes like yours are not only wrong, but they are also incapable of diminishing a person's worth. Greg opened his mouth, perhaps to offer an apology, but Thomas raised a hand, halting him. I don't need an apology, Thomas said firmly. The court has already spoken for me. What I want you to remember is this. Every customer who walks through that door deserves respect, regardless of how they look, what they wear, or where they come from. Turning away, Thomas's gaze settled on a different section of the showroom, his eyes lingering on a display featuring a rival brand, another company that also sold planes, but one that had never been involved in the cruel treatment he had suffered. With a small smile, he glanced over at Marcus, his loyal friend and companion in this journey. "Let's go," Thomas said, his voice calm but resolute. The two men moved toward the rival section, where a staff member greeted them with genuine respect and warmth. Thomas, now fully in control of the situation, spoke with authority. "I'd like to see your finest PLS," he said, his tone professional, showing that he was no longer a man looking to be validated but one who could make decisions that mattered. Back in the original showroom, the employees, still standing in stunned silence, exchanged glances filled with regret and discomfort. Greg's head hung low, his fingers gripping the counter as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The realization of what his attitude had cost them, both a valuable customer and, more importantly, a person of influence, finally hit him. He had been wrong, and the consequences were now evident. An hour later, Thomas emerged from the rival showroom, Marcus at his side. He had just signed a contract for the plane he had always dreamed of owning, the same aircraft he had been ridiculed for aspiring to. The pride in his achievement was not simply about acquiring a plane. It was about doing so on his own terms, with no compromise, no bending to the pressure or mockery of others. It was a personal victory, a moment of redemption. As he walked out of the rival showroom, Thomas cast one final glance toward the old showroom. There, in the distance, stood those who had once mocked him, now standing in quiet reflection, their faces heavy with remorse. Without a word, Thomas offered them a fleeting smile, acknowledging the silent apology they would never voice. Then, without looking back, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the place that had once sought to diminish his worth. Above, the airplane he had just purchased sat ready, gleaming in the sun, its sleek body reflecting the light as a symbol of all that he had fought for. The aircraft was not just a machine, it was the embodiment of freedom, self-respect, and the unyielding determination to rise above the prejudices of others. The plane cut through the sky effortlessly, its sharp contours reflecting the bright sunlight. Thomas sat back in the spacious cabin, gazing out the window, his heart swelling with pride. Next to him, Marcus sat quietly, the loyal friend who had been with him every step of the way. The plane descended gradually toward the familiar land where Thomas's family awaited him. As the aircraft touched down, Thomas stepped out into the embrace of his wife and children, their bright smiles radiating pride and joy. Their happiness was not just for his success, but for the man he had become, someone who had stood firm against the tides of mockery and prejudice. His wife, her voice thick with emotion, stepped forward and took his hand. "You did it," she whispered, her words filled with admiration and love. His children, dressed neatly, rushed toward him, their voices calling his name with a mix of reverence and joy. The moment was everything Thomas had worked for. Not just the airplane, but the unwavering support of those who mattered most to him. That evening, the Thomas family sat around their dinner table, the warm glow of the lights casting a soft ambiance. The conversation wasn't just about the triumph of acquiring the plane. It was about the journey, the lessons learned, and the strength required to overcome the challenges. "I'm not perfect," Thomas said, looking at each of his family members. "But I've always believed that no one has the right to define our worth but ourselves. What I did wasn't just for my dream, it was to prove that we can overcome any prejudice as long as we don't give up." Marcus, sitting beside his father, nodded in agreement. "Justice doesn't come easily," he added. "We must stand up for it, fight for it, and never stay silent when we see injustice." Elsewhere, the people who had once mocked Thomas were now facing the consequences of their actions. Greg, who had been so full of arrogance, found himself no longer employed at the aircraft showroom. The company, after enduring significant fines and court-ordered oversight, had to undergo a complete overhaul of its operations and training practices. The painful lessons learned were not just in the legal documents but were etched into the minds of everyone involved. The customers who had once joined in mocking Thomas were now faced with the reality of their behavior. Their laughter had been replaced by a deep sense of shame, a reflection of the painful truth about how they had treated someone based on preconceived notions. The lesson they had learned was one they would not forget: the value of treating every individual with respect. Thomas's story did not end with the purchase of his dream plane. It became a powerful symbol, not just of his personal victory, but of the larger fight against prejudice and racism. He had fought not only for himself but for others who had been silenced by the weight of discrimination. As he boarded his plane once again, Thomas carried with him not just the realization of a dream, but the satisfaction of knowing that his journey had broken down barriers of judgment, of prejudice, and of fear. The plane soaring through the vast blue sky was more than a mere vehicle. It was a symbol of justice, determination, and the unwavering belief in one's worth. This wasn't just a tale of purchasing an airplane. It was a profound lesson in resilience, self-respect, and courage in the face of adversity. Thomas's journey reminds us all that, regardless of how others may try to judge us, our worth is not determined by the opinions of others, but by our own unwavering belief in ourselves. If you were in Thomas's position, how would you respond? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss future content. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next video.